I'm going to reload the play. Oh, right, that's what you mean. I don't need it. Yeah. What I'm
UCL Economics and Finance Society's joint debate for today on the motion, as you can see on the screen, this House believes that austerity has failed in the UK. I hope everyone's looking forward to it. I certainly am. I will get forward to speakers tonight and getting to the debate as soon as I've gotten through a few little announcements about what our society does. So, mainly we run these public debates. These happen every Monday, usually at 7, this time at 6:15, slightly earlier time. But they're always great fun to come along to. As you'll notice, there's free wine down at the entrance, and we run a competition, which I'll explain slightly later, about which you can win a bottle of port or a box of chocolates, which is a very fun thing to go away on a Monday evening with. The other thing that we mainly do is we run training workshops. These are on Thursdays, again at 7, again in varying rooms, but they're great fun. Go to it, learn how to do debating, participate in a few debates, get judged on how you do them, and depending on which one it is, potentially go forward to go to a competition at the weekend where you can enjoy great success and even more free wine. So you can see what we're focused on. To attend the training workshops, you generally need to buy membership for society. So if you want to do that, you can go online to the UCLU website or go to the CSC reception on the Bloomsbury Theatre building to buy a membership. But of course, our public debates it's in the name public, and anyone can attend. I think there are a few people from outside UCL here tonight, and I'm very happy to have them here. So that's what we do, that's who we are. I have a couple more special events which we're running to mention. One is that we are running an internal competition this Sunday the 8th, and it's going to be great fun. Come along and come and judge if you want to. Get your first taste of debating without having to go to another university with a bunch of other university people, and hang out with everyone from society who are a great bunch. The second thing we're doing quite soon is our women's workshop, which is on the 15th, I believe. The women's workshop is a debating workshop meant explicitly for women or people who identify as women, or non-binary people. You can come along and get some training just for you, because many people from these groups are traditionally disadvantaged in debating because they don't get into it early, they're encouraged to get into it. Sometimes they're little because they're speaking style, and it's a great thing to have training workshops specifically for people who have systematic disadvantages against them. The other thing that we're having is our schools workshop, which is happening this Monday the 9th. You can come talk to our 2 schools chairs sitting down there and raising their hands a bit, raise them higher. Woo! Hello. Because we're looking for volunteers, we're going to have a bunch of school children coming here. Doing debating is fun. Teaching debating is also a really valuable, fun thing to do, especially to secondary school children who occasionally say really fun things. And the last thing that we're doing is a Halloween social this Friday, less formal than the other things. Come along. I think we'll be starting at the TCR, a bit of a pub crawl, a bit of a Halloween thing, prizing the best costume. It's a bit late, but I'm happy to dig out my robot costume again and win it. So that's the last of our events. Talking about the debate tonight. Please don't record the debate tonight, because though the society itself is recording it and live streaming it there, and you can look at it online and Google Hangout if you aren't here, maybe you already are. I only ask people for permission for recording for the society. Anyone else who might be a journalist or just someone who wants to record their friend speaking, we need to make sure that everyone has given their consent to the explicit thing which is happening sum up everything they've heard, explain to you why they think they have won the debate. And after that, we will then break up and go to the TCR, which is our regular bar of choice. And
Is there a vote?
yes, there is a vote, which I'll get
in
to.
the bar or here?
Hopefully here. Yeah, we hold two votes at public debates. We hold a vote at the beginning and a vote at the end. Because we want to make sure that we know how people have been persuaded, not just what they think. So I'm going to first interview. Sometimes I say words and I have no idea why. I'm going to first introduce all of the speakers up here, and then we will hold our initial vote, and then we'll get to the debate. So, speaking first, in proposition, we have Neil Lawson, chair of the left-leaning pressure group Compass, and a former advisor to Gordon Brown. Please welcome him here tonight. And speaking first, in opposition, we have Mark Littlewood, Director General of the Institute of Economic Affairs and former Chief Press Spokesman for the Liberal Democrats and the pro-Euro Conservative Party. Please welcome him here tonight as well. Speaking second in proposition, we have Dawn Foster, writer for The Guardian and The Independent and a regular political commentator for Sky News, Channel 4 News and BBC Newsnight. Please welcome her here tonight. And speaking second in opposition, we would have had Ben Harris-Quinney, chairman of the O Group, the UK's oldest conservative think tank. And unfortunately, he had to back out due to a family matter. And we now have the replacement speaker he very kindly arranged, who is Nick Connor. Nick is the Home and Social Affairs Research Fellow for the O Group and a Fellow of the Royal Society of Arts. He recently wrote a policy paper arguing against the tax credit cuts, which was key to Tory MPs turning against the plan. Nick worked for Conservative campaign headquarters before the 2010 general election, then left politics to work for Social Enterprises, where he has worked for the Big Issue and EN campaigns, helping the unemployed become self-employed. Nick is a regular political commentator in the media, being on previously BBC News, BBC Newsnight, BBC The Big Questions, Sky News, ITV News, 5 Live, and LBC Radio. A lot of things. Please welcome Nick here tonight. So, now that we know what we'll be doing and exactly who will be doing it, I feel myself free to take the initial vote for tonight. So if I can get some volunteers up to count the people who think what, and if they have the paper to count it with, then I can start saying who would characterise themselves as being proposition to this motion. Who is in favour of the motion? Who thinks that austerity has failed in the UK? Who is for this? At this stage, before hearing anyone, who thinks austerity has failed in the UK? Put your hands high. Okay, and now I'd like to switch over and go for the opposition side. Who opposes this? Who does not think that austerity has failed in the UK? Who is against the motion? Who does not think austerity has failed in the UK? And the last position you can take, that of abstention. You're not sure where you stand. You think you're somewhere in between the two. You're waiting to be convinced. Who thinks they're in abstention on this motion? Okay, so we'll keep those votes secret and announce them at the end when we announce the general vote, and we'll be able to see not just who thinks what, but how people have been persuaded and how they have changed their views. And now, with no further ado, I can get to the speeches, and I would like to invite the first speaker for proposition, Mr. Neil Lawson, to take the floor. Thank you.
I was introduced as a former advisor to Gordon Brown. I was a former advisor to Gordon Brown. There's only one problem. He never ever took my advice. Maybe he didn't take my advice because I'm not an economist, so I will confess now I'm not an economist. So those who are in the room, which seems to be most of you, then you will pull me to shreds, I'm sure. Look, this House believes that austerity has failed the UK. My proposition is I don't think we've really tried austerity. So how would we know? Let me unravel that and try and explain that. The world economy crashed on September the 15th in 2008. It didn't crash because governments anywhere were spending too much money. It crashed because people who couldn't afford rents were being sold subprime mortgages. The world economy crashed because of derivatives and credit default swaps that were all being bundled up and sold around, and every bank was just hoping that they were the last people holding the piece of paper, and eventually the music was going to stop and someone was going to be holding the piece of paper, and then boom, the whole economy goes through the floor. It was then the states and public money, the states as in, states across the world, and public money that stepped in and sorted out the mess. We were days from chaos. It could have been Lehman Brothers went under. They couldn't allow any more the market had failed. Governments couldn't allow any more banks to go under. They couldn't allow the cash machines to stop running. And it was governments that stepped in, public money that stepped in. Gordon Brown stepped in. I would have advised him if I was still working for him to step in, and he did. And we were literally days away from anarchy. And then in all of that, George Osborne, who's also not an economist, spotted a political opportunity. He spotted the political opportunity to blame Labour for the crash for spending too much money. Absolute, utter, economic illiteracy. It was not the reason whatsoever for the crash. It was because the finance world and the city was allowed to be too free. But Labour got itself in a real mess and couldn't admit that. Because its whole economic plan was to let the city rip, make as much money as they could, top skin that wherever they could, furrow it through the treasury and spend it on benefits, tax credits, etc., etc. They couldn't explain that was their policy because they didn't think it was going to be popular with the Daily Mail and the British public. So they did it through smoke and mirrors and tried to redistribute. And it was based on sand. It was built on the city and its freedom, and it could never last. And it wasn't going to last, and it didn't. But Osborne steps in and says and blames the government, and Labour couldn't admit that everything to do with their economic strategy was wrong. So they kind of dodged around and ducked around the issue of spending too much and didn't know what to say. And Osborne, brilliant politician that he is, useless economist, got away with it and parked Labour in the corner of being reckless with the country's finances. And they weren't reckless with the finances, they were reckless with the amount of freedom they gave finance and the city to do whatever they want, and it was always going to crash. And it did. So Osborne gets in and goes for 18 months of, reasonable austerity, cutting investment, increasing VAT, taking that money out of the economy, and found out after 18 months that it wasn't working. The moment he got in 2010, the economy was growing. It was growing because Labour's plan, actually, after the crash, was pretty sensible. It was a kind of measure of some cuts, but also of investment. And the economy was growing, and then gets slammed into reverse by Osborne, who makes all of these cuts, works out 18 months later that it isn't working, and then starts growing the economy through QE, through investment. So we have really tried austerity. We tried a bit of it for a while, and then Osborne realised that Osborne would be on my side if he was in tonight, because he knows it wasn't working, because that's why he reversed the policy. If we'd have had less austerity, we'd have had more growth. And the proof is one place. The proof is in the USA. It's grown consistently and more fully than any other economy in the world because they had no austerity. because they kept investing to grow. Britain's done a little bit better than the Eurozone, but that's a basket case for other reasons. But the USA shows that an anti-austerity policy is the right measure. And we've been sold this terrible line that national economies are the same as household economies. Again, absolute and complete economic illiteracy. They're not. And even households don't operate like households in terms of only spending what they've got. If they did, then no one would own a house. Right? National economies, can, must, and should borrow. They don't have to repay in the same way as households. It's ridiculous economics, but again, good politics. Osborne saying we maxed out on the credit card, as if that analogy worked. It completely and utterly doesn't. So where are we at in terms of the economy, and now 5 coming up for 6 years of Osborneomics? The fundamentals of our unbalanced economy haven't changed one bit. Another crash is coming around the corner because we've done nothing to hem the city in, and they're lending in the same kind of reckless ways. It's unbalanced in terms of finance over production, over consumption over investment, imbalance in terms of profits going to shareholders and executives, not to workers, and therefore wages are stagnating, therefore there's no demand in the economy. It's unbalanced in terms of the regions, it's unbalanced in terms of climate or green crap, as Cameron now calls it. There is likely to be another crash. I think Labour were terrible in terms of the economy. I think the Tories have been worse. And there aren't any short-term fixes other than the long-term investment in a productive economy, in skills, in wages, on the things that will really make a difference. And all of that requires a new kind of business model that perhaps we can discuss, which isn't all about short-term profit maximisation for the few. And if you don't believe me, then believe Andrew Haldane, who's been saying exactly that, and Mark Carney, who's been saying exactly that. And they're not politicians, they're pretty good economists. And I would just say that if people want a small state for political and ideological reasons, that's absolutely fine. If you want to narrow the state and reduce it and marginalise it, that's your politics, that's fine. But don't dress that up as economics, and don't dress that up as austerity working, because it isn't.
Thank you for that very fine speech, Wilson. I'd like to now introduce to the audience, again, Mark Littlewood for the first speech in opposition to the motion.
Well, thank you. I didn't think I was actually going to agree with Neil very much, but I agree with quite a bit of what he said, but I find myself on the other side of the motion. It was not reckless public spending that crashed the economy. I don't think anybody claims that. It was a banking crisis that caused us from a normal economy. But as Warren Buffett said, when the tide goes out, you see who's swimming naked. And we were swimming naked. We had not prepared ourselves for any eventuality, really, other than that the economy would continue to grow at 3% a year. It wasn't overspending that caused it. It was overspending that exposed us to a serious problem when the tide went out. I agree with Neil as well. I will use analogies, but I agree with Neil as well that the national economy and a household are not the same economic units. They're useful to show analogies. I mean, if you were earning a certain salary and every year you were spending 10% more than you were bringing in, you might get away with that for some period of time. If you suddenly lost your job through no fault of your own, and you had been overspending and overspending, then you get problems. Here are the economic facts. I agree with Neil that austerity has not really been tried, so it's difficult to say that it's failed. And what a horrible grim word it is, austerity. As if the choice is kind of monochrome or 3D Technicolor, austerity or fun, austerity or growth, austerity or wealth. What I think austerity means is attempting as an economy to live within your means. And we are conclusively failing to do that over a long period of time, including under the previous coalition government and this government. The scale of debt and spending, overspending, that we have in the public sector is truly terrifying. We have probably racked up not Gordon Brown's fault uniquely, it's not George Osborne's fault uniquely, over generations, about £6 trillion worth of debt and liabilities. If you build in the liabilities, what we need to pay out in public sector pensions, PFI deals and the rest of it, not just our balance sheet debt, about £6 trillion worth. Over the course of the last Parliament, with George Osborne in charge making his savage cuts, the government spent £600 billion more than it brought in tax, about an overspend of £10,000 for every man, woman and child in the country, over and beyond tax receipts. The cuts were about 1% a year in real terms. Actual cuts, first government cuts I've seen in my lifetime, but 1% a year in real terms. If you were eating 100 cream cakes a day and you cut down to 99 cream cakes a day, would you say you were on a diet? I wouldn't. That is broadly the position that the government has got itself into. Sure, I'll take it.
You're going to take the analogy of one person eating 100 cream cakes, obviously that's nonsense. But if you're feeding, say, 100 people, and that's their meal for the day, one person can go hungry.
Well, the problem is at some point you need to live within your means. At some point, we can spend as an economy collectively more money than we have. We can do that, and we can pass on. And I was about to thank you, looking at the age of people in this audience, and to pass on the thanks of my parents to you, because my dad, who was affluent, is getting a large number of benefits, and you guys are going to pick up the bill. I would like to personally pass on, he's just turned 70, his thanks to you. You'll be paying for that. You won't get the same thing. I'm 43 years old. I would like to pass on my tentative thanks. I think I will get a state pension paid for by you guys. You probably won't get one. You certainly won't get one as generous as me. Collectively, we have to live within our means, and we are not doing so. Since the 1960s, no government in this country has managed to bring in more than about 38% of national income in taxation. It goes up and down a bit. 38% is towards the high end, 30% is towards the low end. It evens out at about 35%. We've had governments of all colours and all persuasions. Left-wing governments, right-wing governments, coalition governments, governments with big majorities, governments with small majorities, governments with no majorities. We have had a panel of different approaches to taxation. Top rates of income tax of 98%, top rates of income tax of as low as 40%. VAT as high as 20%, VAT as low as 5%. We have had virtually every mix of tax policy you could imagine over my lifetime, and have never brought in more than 38% of national income. We are still today spending 43%. You can make the decision, and we collectively have made the decision, to spend on ourselves, or more like spend on my parents and me today, and shuffle the bill to you, kids, the unborn, and the unconceived. That is actually the economic policy we are pursuing. You might consider that moral, you might consider it wise. I consider it to be unfair, dangerous, and reckless. We need a bout of austerity. We need to begin to live within our means. You cannot, as a national economy, year on year, decade after decade, spend more than you are able to raise, unless you are supremely confident that there is going to be massive economic growth. Again, to use the analogy of an individual, if you knew you were bound to get a 10% pay rise every year, you could live a little beyond your means every year, because you can keep paying it back. But that goes back to my initial point. When the tide goes out, when things go wrong, what's your buffer zone? We don't have one. We have £6 trillion worth of liabilities. We are still spending year on year millions of pounds we don't have. You, or the generation after you, are going to pick up the bill. It's not really austerity that's failed. Austerity needs to be tried. It's economic largesse that has failed. And we need to get back to some rudimentary laws of basic arithmetic. We need to live within our means. We are just edging towards being able to do so. But it has been a long, painful, and slow process to even balance our budget under George Osborne. And when he finally does it, if he manages to do it at the end of this Parliament, 5 years later than he initially promised, we will have had 2 decades of the government spending more than it's doing it. That is, in my view, outrageous, wrong, and economically dangerous. Austerity hasn't failed. The problem is we haven't had enough of it. Thanks very much.
Thank you for that excellent first speech in opposition to the motion. One thing before I get to the next speakers, I did forget to say at the beginning about our Twitter feed, which you can see at the back and might have engaged in. If you tweet the hashtag UCLU debating, it will go through a phase of moderation to take out any outrageous things you will say, but then it will probably be posted up. So feel free to engage in that way in a bit as well. And now I can invite our second proposition speaker, who is Dawn Foster, up the stage.
I've had two pieces of advice that I always try and pass on to my friends and people I meet for a long, long time. The first one is to never ever sleep with somebody who is rude to waiters. And the second one is to never ever listen to somebody who equates the economy with the household budget. I'm pleased that Neil and Mark agree with me on the household budget analogy. I'm not sure what they feel about people who are rude to waiters, but I have to be passed in the bar afterwards. When Lehman Brothers crashed, I was like you. I'm sure a lot of you are in your second year of university. I was halfway through my first degree. I wasn't sure what I wanted to do. I also wasn't sure what on earth was happening in the world. I had no idea what it meant for me. I had no idea what it meant for my family. And I stayed in university for another year, and I left in 2010. And I started writing about the public and about cuts, because that was what was happening, and then about housing and all sorts of calamities that had fallen out of the crash. Mark equated austerity and cuts, and I do believe that we have had austerity here, to eating 100 cream cakes a day and then suddenly stopping eating one. Somebody in the audience rightly pointed out that we have to think about who this happened to. Who is the one person who is no longer eating cream cakes? I can tell you about one man I met recently, who I went to his house to interview him in Redcar. He was an ex-door neighbour of a steelworker who just lost his job. And when I went to see him, he apologised that he couldn't make me a cup of tea because his electricity had been cut off, and he hadn't had any money from the job centre for a month because he'd been sanctioned because he'd broken his leg, pulled ahead, but still was 14 minutes late for his appointment. So for a whole month, he had no money to live on. And he was living in a town up north that now has lost thousands and thousands of jobs. I've been to food banks, and 1 million people in Britain have also been to food banks, unlike me, to try and get food to feed their children, to feed themselves. And they're in all sorts of jobs. It isn't just young people who've been hit by austerity. It's the very, very poorest, the most vulnerable, often disabled people. And part of the reason why the economy isn't a household budget is because if I cut out pub lunches, I don't suddenly need to massively increase spending later along the line. Whereas, yeah.
You talk about how one person, if you continue to spend more than we actually get in, and continue to build it out, then there's going to be many more than one person in the future who actually have to chop that. So you're just passing on that burden to someone.
If you let me get to my next point, I'll explain exactly what happens. The problem is, if you cut mental health services, it gets worse later on in life. If you sanction somebody for a week, the job centre doesn't just say, £59 if that person is under 25. That person goes to a food bank. That person has a mental health crisis. That person can't pay their rent. Everything snowballs. A lot of my friends are doctors, and every time I speak to them, I say, how is it going? And they say, it's okay, I feel comfortable in my ability to do my job, but what I don't feel comfortable is in my ability to send that person out and know that person will be okay. Every person who comes to see them with a mental health crisis, with any form of health problem, often they have to say to them, how is your housing situation? How are you feeling about your relationship? But increasingly, a lot of them have to ask people who come to them with health problems and say, when was the last time you ate? And often the answer is during summer holidays. A lot of parents who come to them say that because of the lack of free school dinners and because their benefits have been massively cut, even though they're in work, they're having to skip meals to feed their children. And the point of austerity is, supposedly, that we make our economy stronger. And in the meantime, we tighten our belts a bit and it all gets better. But that hasn't happened at all. Our economy is not any stronger than it was in 2008. Part of that problem is a huge amount of GDP is reliant on house prices, and they have grown and grown and grown. Who in this room thinks they'll be able to afford a house within 5 years of graduating? Well done, good for you. I graduated 5 years ago. I earned far above the national average, and I don't think I'll be able to do it in 10 years. I don't know anybody in my friendship circle who graduated at the same time who would. 10 years ago, that would be a completely different story. If we had a house price crash tomorrow, and increasingly I'm seeing papers from all around the world that say that Britain is heading exactly for that. Moody's, who aren't known for their left-wing bias, say that a house price crash in Britain could wipe 6% of GDP. We have had very, very little growth. We have had massive, massive cuts that have affected the poorest. And our economy is still reliant on a house price rise that is locking more and more people out of any form of decent life. So is the economy robust? Not remotely. Any increase in interest rates could cause a huge, huge problem. People who are just affording to pay their mortgages now will suddenly find themselves unable to. Because if you look at people's wages, they are still on average £800 lower than they would have been in 2008. So if you had graduated 5 years earlier, then you'd be earning £800 more, and now you won't. The economy is also geographically stilted, and austerity has made it worse. When I remember at university, George Osborne told us that the private sector would save us. The private sector would step in. We'd cut public sector jobs, and that would cut spending. The private sector would step in. 80% of new private sector jobs are in London, and unfortunately, 80% of British people don't live in London. So that's a huge problem, and it's getting worse. So regional inequalities have deepened, and actually, what I really want to point out here is that austerity isn't just a short-term thing. It affects people's lives forever. It affects children's life chances forever. Children who have grown up in poverty will die younger. Their education will be worse. And actually, that's a huge problem. Stress and family breakdown results from benefit cuts. It results from being poorer. It results from never, ever owning your home. So has austerity failed? Yes, because Britain, in the long term, will be far, far worse off for it.
Thank you for that excellent speech. I'd now like to introduce Nick Connor, the second Speaker of Opposition.
No, thank you. I think actually technically I'll be the third speaker because I'm a substitute today. Unfortunately, Ben Harris-Quinny couldn't make it today, so I'm kind of the Harry Kane to his Wayne Rooney, full of promise, and unlike Ben and Wayne, full of hair as well. I had about an hour to get here tonight, not just get here, go home, put a suit on, and write a speech. And I managed to get here. I failed putting my suit on, as you may notice, it's two-toned. And but hopefully I've managed the third one with the speech. So we're talking about austerity, and again, I think it's been pointed out tonight that we don't really have austerity in the UK. I mean, austerity is a policy to reduce the deficit, and well, honestly speaking, we're not doing that. Actually, George Osborne's target, I think he said he wants to reduce it by 12 billion. I think it's about 10 billion missing that target. So we're not going to see a reduction in the deficit at all. So about 90% of our GDP is spent on the deficit. Our debt, because of this, is growing. It's growing at a rate of 5,170 pounds per second. And if we were to pile this up in £50 notes, that will be 6,561 miles high. So that's a lot of money we don't have and we're spending. Now, once we're here today to talk about austerity, there has been cuts in the government and there has been effect of how government works. What the government has done is basically get rid of some waste and sort of get out of the way. And Dawn, you spoke about sanctions and how THBT, up to 2 weeks ago, I was working in job centres, working with the unemployed. I was helping them set up businesses and become self-employed. And if there's a story of the recession, if there's a story of the last Conservative Lib-Dem coalition, that's a story of growth, of job growth. Employment went up 1.7 million. Every 10 minutes, a job was created in the Midlands. Yorkshire created more jobs than entire France did last year. And this is not sort of government swinging in to rescue people. All this job is people becoming self-employed. There was 5.2 million people self-employed in the UK. And they're not necessarily setting up businesses which will be the new Facebook or the new Toyota. 62% of them are sole traders. People just doing it for themselves. Actually, 90% of all new jobs during the recession were people becoming self-employed. It's something like 15% of the workforce. So what we have seen is the government get out of the way. What we've seen is the government stop having bureaucrats. Before the last Conservative government, the NHS, our NHS, it's the third or fifth, depending on which figures you believe, largest employer in the world. Now, we all like the NHS, we all like to go over and get treatment from a doctor or nurse, but most people employed by the NHS are not doctors or nurses, they're managers. For every doctor and nurse, let's put doctors and nurses in one box, for every doctor and nurse, there was 3 managers, okay? Now, if we get rid of, let's say, a couple of those managers and just get out of the way of the paperwork, then people will be more free to set up businesses and improve our economy. Government has a role, but it isn't the role of be Tarzan and save people. Government has a role of support and help people. But before last Conservative government, and or arguably continuing now with this Conservative government and the coalition before, it has stopped people. One of the reasons I was against the tax credits cut is, yes, if I had a time machine, there wouldn't be tax credits in the first place. But there it was falling. It was falling on working people. People who were going out their day, and they weren't necessarily earning a lot of money, but they needed that support. Now that was right for the government to have that sort of initiative there to help people into employment. But once we get rid of this is £30 a week someone would have to find. And that's £30 from a single mum doing, maybe selling a few sort of makeup on her time, working on the hours. Now, if you extended it, and let's cut it, but give them more time to do it, then we see a greater rise in employment and self-employment. But we can't gradually cut. So the cuts are right, things like tax credits, but it has to be done in a humane and sensible manner. Now, just imagine if we did have austerity, okay? Our economy will grow. People will be more free to earn and indeed spend their money. One of the great things people talk about austerity is in Greece. But since Greece has started austerity, their unemployment, it is high, 25%, but it's been stagnant. It hasn't grown, it hasn't shrunk. And the economy has grown as well. Since austerity, 0.9% of GDP in Greece we have seen growth. So austerity, or let's say cut in government waste, sees a benefit to us. Thank you.
Thank you for that excellent speech on opposition to emotion, and indeed the final of the main speeches. Now we move to the next phase, which is the floor speeches phase. As I have said, these are 3 minutes in length, 30 seconds of which is protected time, in which you can't be offered a point of information. At 30 seconds, again, there will be 1 bang on the gavel, and at 2 minutes, 30 seconds, there'll be 1 bang again. And at 3 minutes, 2 bangs. I just love doing it. Which will signify that your time is up. However, you don't need to make a 3-minute speech. If you just have a short statement to make, or if you want to speak for a minute, feel free to come up. We're always glad to have more people who are in the running for winning some port or some chocolate. One last reminder, there is some wine down the front. You might see me getting some myself. Feel free to come get some for yourself in between speeches. So, I'd like to open up the floor speeches by asking if anyone has a floor speech in proposition of this motion. If anyone has a floor speech in which they'd like to argue that austerity has failed in the UK. I have 2 hands, I'll have to randomly pick one of them. I'm going to go to the person in the maroon jumper. Please come down. Yeah, that's fine.
Yeah. Hi everyone. My name's Badaf. I'm a 3rd year econ student, so as you can tell, I'm pretty interested in this stuff. Now, let's just dispel one myth pretty quickly. Now, when you're talking about GDP growth in Greece, in 2012, Greece was growing at negative 6.3%. The figures from the first quarter of 2012 and up to 2014 stay negative. Negative 4%, negative 4.2%, negative 2.6%. Then we see a tiny little bit of growth at 0.3%. So any indication that suggests that austerity is doing anything is, I'm sorry, complete rubbish. Now, let's dispel one myth quickly. Every government in the world borrows, except for 5 countries: Macau, British Virgin Islands, Brunei, Liechtenstein, and Palau. What's the similarity between places? These are small island nations. They don't need to fund. No, I said China.
Yeah, well, you can add China to the list then.
That's not true.
So
you're telling me China's debt to GDP ratio is 0?
they are lending the, if you take
China's debt to GDP ratio is 0. That's not true.
I'm offering a point of information.
That's not true. What's the similarities between these countries? They don't need to fund hospitals, they don't need to fund schools. So what's the key figure here? Yes, everybody needs to borrow. All our parents borrow. If you need a mortgage, you need to borrow. But the important thing is whether the debt is sustainable. Now, let me give you an analogy. If you've got somebody who's unemployed who wants to borrow £2,000, if you've got somebody earning 50 grand a year who wants to borrow £200,000 for a house, which of those two is more sustainable? Obviously, the person who's earning it, even though the figures are bigger. Now, these guys over here like to keep quoting all these figures to scare us about 6 trillion and all this. But what really matters is the debt to GDP ratio, which before the crash was at 40% in the UK, a totally sustainable level. Now, anybody who studies economics will know that in certain conditions, you can actually keep a deficit, but at the same time, keep that debt to GDP ratio low, or even reduce it if growth is sufficient, if inflation is low, and if interest rates are low. Now, what we had is a situation where, as Neil greatly pointed out, we had a massive global crash and we had to bail out the banks, otherwise the economy would have collapsed in total and the debt skyrocketed to 80%. Now we've got a high deficit, and yes, it needs to go down. But here's a fundamental fact about the economy. Your spending, my spending is your income. If I stop spending, your income goes down. So tax revenues will go down, businesses don't get that income, and and essentially you can't get growth, and then you can't cut the deficit. It just doesn't work. Yeah.
So I just think you're out of the point information times. Yeah.
Okay. So what is this really about? It's not about debt. It's, as they said, it's about this principle that the government can't do anything. It's about, we mentioned here, waste. Now, what does waste actually mean, the waste that the governments get rid of? The waste the governments get rid of is leading to the overcrowding in the hospital, because we've seen a real, because we've seen a cut in the, not a cut in the NHS, but the streets in real.
Okay, thank you for that nice floor speech in proposition to the motion. And now, to take the opposing side, I'd like to invite someone to make a floor speech in opposition to this motion. Who wants to argue that austerity has not failed in the UK? Again, I seem to have two hands, and I'm going to randomly pick the pink shirt, the back one. Please come down.
Hi, my name is Matthew Bill. I'm second year doing econ. I'd like to sort of start by trying to make a comparison with the environment. It's only about in the last decade that we've actually started to realise environmental impact and started to make a change on that. And we haven't yet realised the impact we're making by borrowing more than we actually bring in. Now, we heard a lot by the proposition about benefits, and we particularly heard stories, one-off stories, which are very true around the country, where parents might have to miss meals to feed their children, where people are becoming unemployed. But what I would argue, firstly, is that there's a flip side to this. There are also people who, before the crash, or earlier on in the crash, were on unemployment benefits, and now they're in a job. Okay, and what the argument here is, and what it comes down to, is actually this statement that the economy is no stronger than it is in 2008, which we heard from the first proposition. That's entirely false. No, thank you. That's entirely false. What we heard here, more jobs from one city than we had in the entirety of France. And we have put stricter cuts in place than most of Europe. And our economy is stronger than most of Europe. So what I would argue really is, do we think the cuts are good? No. But do we need them? Yes. And the reason is, if you look currently at what we're spending, we are spending 7% of our GDP each year just on paying interest on the debt that we have. 7%. No, thank you. We have 7% is almost half of what we spend on schooling and education. So we have here saying that actually, when you're on benefit, if you're being cut, well, that's going to affect our education. Well, half of our education budget could be spent again if we didn't have this debt. So what I would argue really is that we have to live within our means, because otherwise, essentially what we're doing is just passing on this burden to future generations. And we have realised this with environmental facts, but we haven't yet realised this with the economy. Thank you.
Thank you for that excellent speech in opposition. And now, to complete the trio which we go through, I will ask for a speech in abstention. So you aren't sure, you are persuaded, you don't think that either side is totally right, you are in abstention. Looks like I have one hand up this time, so my decision is a lot easier. You in the grey shirt.
I hate to begin by admitting that I am also another economist. I chose to speak in abstention tonight, not because I don't have any opinions. For those of you in the audience who know me, I have a lot of opinions on a wide range of matters. But rather, this debate really boils down to how we define success and, of course, failure. But let me just begin by reiterating and speaking on some of the points raised tonight. Mr. Lawson gave a wonderful narrative of the financial crisis, derivatives, bailouts, Hank Paulson, Ben Bernanke, and so on. And I agree with him that the crisis was not the result of Labour overspending. It was, in fact, the result of the things he mentioned. But where Labour did mess up, and for the first floor speaker mentioned this, is that Labour did not cut spending in the good times. It's very fine to cut spending when you're growing. And this meant that Chancellor Osborne and the rest of the Conservative government had to pick up this measure. So that's something to bear in mind. That in the nice period, Labour did not cut spending. But let's just move on to what I said at the beginning. This debate boils down into answering what defines success and failure. So let's ask one question. Has austerity failed to deliver growth, or has it impeded recovery? The answer to that question is a resounding no. While the UK economy is not growing as quickly as the United States, it's still chugging along. Let's ask another question. Has austerity failed to reduce the overall debt burden and deficit? Yes, Mr. Littlewood said that, in fact, austerity has not actually happened. This is indeed the case. George Osborne has another 5, 10, 15 years to fulfill his promise. So we haven't had austerity and debt is still growing. I think the third question is the one that interests most of you here tonight. Has austerity failed to raise living standards? Yes, it has. The reason being is not that the rich are getting wealthier or the middle class are getting wealthier. In fact, let me point you to evidence by Charles Goodhart, the leading economist at the LSE. The result of lower living standards is that wages have not been growing. We've had very low unemployment, but wages have not been growing. And to give you some economics about this, this has been a result of falling productivity. So in any case, austerity has failed. It has failed in achieving greater productivity growth by not investing sufficiently in education, by not investing sufficiently in infrastructure. But let me bear in mind, for those of you who think austerity has failed and there should be more spending cuts, this means higher future taxes. That is something you have to be prepared to consider in giving arguments in proposition. Thank you.
Thank you for that excellent floor speech and abstention. Now we have been moving not in a straight line but in a circle. We've come back to the beginning, and I'd like to ask for another floor speech in proposition, if anyone has it in them. Can I get a floor speech in proposition? The person in the red jumper there, please.
Yeah, that's fine. Yeah. I'll use this. I'm actually not an economics student. I'm a classicist, so obviously should have. Yeah, good. So obviously I know what I'm talking about. Yeah. So basically, after 18 months of austerity, growth is not exactly happening the way we planned. Inequality is something that I've noticed has gone up quite a bit as well. I totally agree that we should have, within our means. I don't see a problem with that, but I don't really think we can be implementing that on everyone when we're facing kind of serious social issues at the time. Kind of from writing myself, I've gone into Job Centre a couple of times. This equality is just stark around town. Homelessness has gone up quite a bit. And you see people in there whose confidence in the whole job market is just so low. I've seen people in tears in town just because they're not sure what's going to happen with their tax credits or benefits or jobs. And I haven't really seen anyone jump off the street one day and say, right, I'm going to start a business.
I'm not putting information.
I'm good, thank you. Yeah, because literally people just sometimes don't know what's going to happen, and this confidence, I think, is a real problem. They don't know whether a sort of more austerity is going to be implemented, and I think it's a real burden on people's aspirations and what it makes them able to do mentally. Yeah, so this may have worked for Germany. I personally don't think that austerity can work here, and the government is relying too much on this kind of hand-me-down approach and self-startup attitude. But this won't work when no one believes in an economy that's already had 18 months of austerity. So basically, austerity won't work here. It hasn't. I think basically we need a new approach because no one believes in austerity at the moment, and it hasn't worked. Thank you very much.
Thanks for that excellent fourth of our floor speeches, speaking in proposition. And now, you know the pattern. I'll be asking for one in opposition to this motion. Can I have someone who's willing to grind either 3 minutes or something slightly shorter into an opposition speech. I've got someone whose hand was up previously too. I have the person in the white shirt. Please come down.
Okay, I'm gonna start my speech off with a few points of rebuttal. We heard a lot from the proposition about how everyone borrows and that, you know, it's something we have to do. No one from this side of the room has said we are going to totally cancel borrowing. We just talk about bringing it back down to sustainable levels where it's not going to impact adversely on our futures. Additionally, the lady who just spoke previously said, you know, aspirations right now are at an all-time low. But I think aspirations will only go lower, especially if we know that the rewards for the work we're doing won't be reaped by us, but instead by paying off the debts that these people have raked up for us. You guys spoke about the USA being a good example of not implementing austerity measures. I think, no, it is a bad example, and it's actually a good example for why we should implement austerity. You know, last year, nearing Christmas time, and this year is on nearing Christmas time, there is going to be a government shutdown in the USA. The whole government shutting down and not being able to invest and not being able to operate, that is a horrendous situation to be in because debt has risen to such high levels. What does this do? This means businesses, no thank you. Businesses will stop investing. Businesses will think twice because of an unstable government that isn't able to make decisions. Additionally, I'm going to talk about the point of the banking crisis. The banking crisis happened, and yes, we were borrowing at a level of 40%. And I think, you know, some people would think it was the worst thing in the world that it happened, but at the time it happened, it meant we could deal with it because we're at 40%. And now that we've risen back up to 80%, I think it's time that, you know, we all sort of looked around and thought, you know what, it is time to cut again. You know, we've got to live within our means, and that's been the general gist from this side of the room, and it's absolutely correct. Like right now, we have been driving for more efficiency, and although George Osborne hasn't implemented the, you know, textbook definition of austerity, he is working towards cutting, which I think is the right way to go. At the end of this year, the growth for the UK will be 2.7%. This has been revised upwards, and we're going faster than any other G8 nation. You know, that is good results. That's what we want. I know wages are still low, but when you've just come back from one of the worst financial crises since the Great Depression, wages will be low for some time, but it's about getting the majority of people into work and getting them the confidence and the skills that they need to be able to, you know, pursue promotions, to pursue better positions in office. And additionally, continuous spending won't get us anywhere. You spoke about how if we had a housing price crash, that 6% of our GDP would be wiped off. If 6% of GDP was wiped off, that would be very adverse to the fact that we've got almost 6 trillion of debt. Hence, it won't, if 6% is wiped off, it won't be 7% that we're paying towards, you know, the interest in our fees. It'll be something more like 10, 11% that we pay, and that's less money for schools, less money for hospitals. And at the end of the day, the people who are going to suffer won't be, you know, the people who are long gone and who reap the benefits, you know, a few years ago. It will be us. It will be us and future generations who have had no say on this matter. Thank you very much.
Thanks for that excellent full speech in opposition. And now I turn to the final category, abstention. Who is unsure, who is unpersuaded, who thinks there is something wrong with the motion or that they cannot decide? Who would like to make a floor speech in abstention on the motion? Can I get you in the black jumper sitting there? Thanks.
Yeah, sure. I'm not an economist either, so at the risk of speaking to a room full of economists. I'd quite like to introduce a dimension that I don't think I've heard much about this evening, which is a set of personal elements. That there's been a lot of talk about finances, and part of the reason that I would abstain is that I can offer no valid and decent solution to a very pressing financial question, which is how do we actually deal with being a compassionate society whilst living within our means. But I come from West Wales, where we're a load of raving nationalists, and things are hard there in terms of the personal cost that austerity has brought to our communities. That it's a sense of disenfranchisement and alienation amongst my friends and amongst the people that I know, that austerity is not something that we ask for, and that this government is not making choices that are good for us. And it's a sense of their priorities, a sense of the government living well and us having it very hard, of there is money to spend on Trident, but not to feed the poor. And I think that's something that's really affecting all levels of society, not just young people. I mean, £9,000 tuition fees whilst the elderly can't pay for their heating bills. This is not something that's localised, it's endemic, and it's a class war. Essentially, I think is how I feel it and how a lot of other people feel it. That would be in proposition, but I don't have any answers as to how you would live within your means and balance the books. So for me, I would have to abstain, because regarding austerity, it seems to me that the current state of politics is that people trust a government that appears competent, and that we want to believe in a Labour, Corbyn, whatever government might be in 2020, but we just don't trust them. And the only thing that you can really do is abstain, because we seem to care more for competence than compassion.
Thank you for that excellent floor speech and abstention to the motion. Now, as I think we have both interest and time, I would like to call for a third round of floor speeches, a third and final round of floor speeches. First, again, I would like to look for one in proposition. Who's willing to come up and say a few words in proposition of this motion? You in the dark blue and light blue, come down.
Yeah. I'm going to stand here because the light's bothering me a little. I'm going to start this speech by saying that I'm going to use Marx's definition to evaluate the success of austerity and whether it has worked. So let's look at whether this country is living within its means. The Queen's finances have been ring-fenced from cuts by the government for the next 2 years. What is the only other sector of public spending that has been ring-fenced in this way? It is the NHS. Now, I'm not sure about you, but I think the NHS is more vital for our nation than our Queen. Not to mention that we have a House of Lords with more than 800 members, some of whom, not mentioning any names, turns up once every 2 years to vote for cuts to tax credits and still collects the salary. Second, we have tax cuts we cannot afford. A 10% cut in the business tax rate, a 5% cut in the top rate of income tax. No. And a raise in the inheritance tax threshold. Who does that benefit, ladies and gentlemen? Number 3, there's nothing more ironic than a chancellor, a conservative chancellor, standing up, telling us to be responsible, and at the same time voting for a salary increase for himself in Parliament. Number 4, tax avoidance by by Her Majesty's Revenue and Customs, by their own estimates, is costing this country £22 billion a year. What is the government doing about it? Nothing. Research commissioned by the PCS shows that it's even worse. Number 5, subsidies. Yes.
Just is your argument against austerity in itself and living needs?
I will come to that point at the very end. Okay. Subsidies that go to the wealthy. The Duke of Westminster receives £820,000 a year in taxpayer subsidies simply because he owns land. This is partly an EU matter. Fine, I can see that. But what is the government doing about it? And finally, Royal Mail privatization, the selling off of a profit-making state asset. Ladies and gentlemen, how is that living within our means? And that is what I'm trying to say. We're not living within our means, and that's why austerity is not working. Because we're spending money we don't have on these things. Thank you very much.
Thank you for that excellent speech and proposition and motion. And now, as I think this is extremely aware, I'd like to take a floor speech in opposition to this motion. Can I get someone who's willing enough to say only a few words in opposition to this motion? At the back, I have a hand in black. Please come down.
Just give me a second, okay?
As you can see, I'm not a student. I feel like a bit of an imposter, actually. I'm actually a member of staff. I'm in the Department of Electronic Engineering. I feel very nervous. I shouldn't be, because I should be used to standing in front of classrooms full of students, but not classrooms full of economics students. So forgive me. I just wanted to make one point of what I think is a point of clarification, and I think gets missed in all the discussion here, and that is that what do we mean by government borrowing? What is government borrowing? Okay. And the point was made that the government is not like a household, and that's true. Of course, it's not like a household. The difference between, one of the differences between, as I see it, as a non-economist, difference between household budgets and government budgets is that when households borrow money, the household has to pay it back. When governments borrow money, that is our society, the government on behalf of the people living today, borrow money, it has to be paid back by somebody else. Okay? Government borrowing is deferred taxation. It's not that you're paying less tax, it's that somebody else is going to be paying more tax, namely the future generations. You guys, basically, and your children. Okay, so we are essentially increasing the taxes of people who have yet to be born. So the principle, as I see it, is one of legitimacy and representation. The lady from America, sorry, I can't see her in the audience, but I think it was one of your countrymen that said no taxation without representation, which I think is a good principle. The people who are taxing the people should be accountable to the people. So to me, it's a basic point of legitimacy that you cannot tax people who have yet to be born because they have no rights to kick you out. They have no ability to kick you out of office. And that is a basic problem of legitimacy of government borrowing.
Thank you for that very interesting final floor speech, which brings us to the end of the floor speeches and to the final stage of the debate, which is the summary speeches. The speaking order will be flipped here. Speaking first will be opposition, and then proposition. I remind you that they each have 4 minutes to speak. This side has 4 minutes, and that side has 4 minutes. They can choose to split it up between them how they want. We will bang once at 2 minutes to let them know we're halfway through, and once at 4 minutes to let them know that we're at the end. But we're not going to be doing any bangs of POIs because no POIs can be offered during the summary speeches. So please do not attempt to offer any. So I remind you that after this we'll be taking the vote and giving our prize and announcing who won and going to the bar. So don't leave as soon as this is ended. Don't stop listening either, because now we are getting to the final main speaker engagement, the summary speeches. Please welcome the opposition, whichever speaker wants to go first.
If we're going to define austerity as essentially trying to live within your means, and it seems that that's come out from the floor debate, then I think there is a second argument about what that austerity looks like. You might decide that you don't want trident nuclear missiles, that you want more on housing benefit. You might decide that you want to tax the Duke of Westminster a bit more highly and spend more on the National Health Service. That's fine. You can make those different spending decisions, but you have to make them within a sensible envelope of spending. That's not really about the total amount of money we spend. That's not about what we spend it on. And when we hear from John and others on this side of the house about how chronically badly the welfare state's gone in certain places, there are genuine human tragedies and misery that's caused by failures in our welfare system. People who can't read their cattle and the rest of it. The centralised state bureaucracy is not very good at poverty relief. We spend, including state pensions, upwards of £200 billion a year on welfare transfers, taking money from some people and giving it to others. Usually, not always, but usually taking it from the relatively affluent and giving it to the relatively less affluent. That's the broad flow of the money. Millionaires are net contributors, not net beneficiaries, and those who are out of work or pensioners tend to be net beneficiaries, not net contributors in broad terms. £200 billion a year, £10,000 per household a year is spent on welfare as poverty relief in Britain, to a pretty spectacular lack of effect, I would suggest. And I don't think we should kid ourselves at moving that to £11,000 a year per household or 12,000 will suddenly crack the problem. I think the system's bust, and we need to look at better ways and smarter ways of spending money. But let's agree this. Let's try and live within our means. Let's broadly spend what we're getting in tax. It's not quite as simple as that. If we're really confident our great-grandchildren are all going to be earning £1 trillion a year, well, perhaps shuffling a little bit of debt on them to solve some of those problems isn't that much of a difficulty. But let's be realistic. Let's not overstate the case. The state pension's gone up 2.5% this year. Inflation is minus 0.1%. It's a real increase in pensions. Doesn't mean every pensioner is rich, but it is a real increase. The top 1% of income earners contribute 25% of all tax receipts, income tax receipts. Maybe you don't think that's enough, but it's high. The top 10% of earners contribute more than half of all income tax receipts. Maybe you think that should be higher still, but that's pretty redistributive. And if we are looking at making serious savings, look at the big areas of spending. Yes, we can close down the Duke of Westminster. We can, go after a few millionaires for tax avoidance. But the UK government is spending £1 million every 43 seconds. That's the scale of expenditure we have in this country. And I have to tell you in all frankness that going after the Duke of Westminster might cover your expenditure for a second or two, but it won't cover it for much longer than that. We've got to get back to the basics, and we've got to spend what we can bring in tax receipts. If you think you've got a magic solution to get tax revenues up, that no government, red or blue, majority or coalition, has managed in my entire lifetime, good luck with that plan. No one's actually been able to get tax receipts much higher than 38% of income. So sooner or later, we have to basically live within that envelope. Then we can move on to the serious and sensible debate about what we spend that money on. But we've got to get that expenditure down. To do so, I think, to fail to do so is not just economically dangerous, it is intergenerational theft, and therefore also immoral. So I beg you to support this side of the motion. Thank you.
Okay, and I'd like to now invite the proposition some speakers to sum up their arguments.
We're going to come up together. You'll do the first one.
Look, this is. I'll say it within 2 minutes. Look, this is the what we've heard tonight is the economics of ever decreasing surplus. This isn't about living without our means. This is about knowing when to spend and knowing not when to spend. Look, of course, when the good times are here, government should save money. Let me tell you something, these are not the good times. This is just the moment when government ought to be spending so that the generations that follow us do well, because there is a thriving economy. The worst thing we should do now is cut, because if we cut now, there are no jobs, there are no taxes, there's bigger benefit bills, and generations in the future are going to pay the price. Look at the private sector, sitting on about £750 billion worth of investment, because they have absolutely no confidence in the economy because the government is cutting. These are the bad times. We should be spending now because inflation is so low, borrowing doesn't cost anything. It's an economic madness to go on with this, but it's morally questionable as well. Because the people who are paying the price are not the people who caused the crash. The benefits cap, the bedroom tax, destroying people's lives, sending them from London to all around the country away from their families. We are a rich country. Right? We've got the money to do this. Yes, we've got a proper government. Yes, it should spend effectively. But the people on the sharp end of this should not be the people who are paying the price. So we ought to spend now. We ought to invest in our future. We ought to invest in jobs and skills and public services, get the economy moving. And when it's moving, we can collect the taxes and repay the debt. It's just simple economics. We got it wrong in 1929 after the last big crash. It took until the New Deal. It took until the Labour government. It took until governments realised they could step in and spend, and only governments can. We should do it again now. Over to you.
Very quickly, I am self-employed. I heard from your position earlier that there has been a massive, massive, massive rise in self-employment, which is great. But I'm relatively rare, and I earn a lot more as a self-employed person than I would otherwise. A lot of people who are self-employed, don't even take Ubers. Uber drivers are self-employed, even though they were working for a very big company. And as a result, they have to change their own overheads. And Uber get a huge cut on their offices, on all sorts of things, on national insurance contributions, pension contributions. Who does the rest of it fall on? The self-employed people. So the massive, massive rise in self-employment has actually really, really hurt people. It means that those people who would ordinarily be in good jobs, good paying jobs, are actually not paid very much at all. A lot of businesses fail. A lot of people are made self-employed. And, you know, I'm sure a lot of you have heard about the rising zero-hours contracts. That massively massages figures. And speaking of massaging figures, we heard that, you know, the top 1% pay 10% of their income tax, and the top 10% pay 50% of 25%. That's a declared income. If you, but actually, the best way to find out how much the super rich earn is to go and sit in divorce courts, because that's when it all comes out. You would be so amazed by how much money people hide. And the real story of austerity is people standing outside food banks, people who have been driven to death by benefit sanctions, people who have been moved out of their homes every 50 years because of the cuts, while all the while the super rich get richer and richer and richer. So we've seen widening inequality and almost no benefit for society as a whole. I urge you to support this motion.
Well then, I'd like to thank those summary speakers and these summary speakers and all the speakers out there and them for their initial speeches, because this was really an excellent debate, so please, another round of applause. And now, to end everything out, I would normally remind you of next week's public debate, but of course next week is reading week, so I'm just going to say that come this Thursday at 7 to our training workshop to learn how to do what you saw tonight yourself. It's a great skill to have. Secondarily, I would like to now, before I announce the results of the winning floor speech, take the final vote. So can I get my two volunteers up again, please? Thank you. Okay, so after you've seen everything, after you've heard everything, after you've perhaps thought on a few new comments, who thinks that they are in proposition? Who votes for this motion? Who agrees that austerity has failed in the UK? Hold your hands high if you're in proposition. Got that down. And now, who thinks that they're in opposition? Who thinks that austerity has not failed in the UK? Who would say they are in opposition in this debate? Don't agree that austerity has failed in the UK. And now the final position you can take. Who thinks that they are in abstention? Who still cannot decide? Who has been persuaded into favouring neither one side nor the other? Who cannot in full conscience say that they are proposition or opposition? Who is in abstention? Okay, we've got the result of the voting and we're just counting it up now. But we have already counted up and thought about each of the floor speeches we saw here tonight. I've got to say, tonight had an excellent array of floor speeches. As you can see on that tweet, Cassia thinks the same. Awesome floor speeches today. Everyone was very good. In the end, two people were very close to each other, and we had to make a value judgment and a choice decision. But eventually, on balance, finally, we decided that the winning floor speech had to be the floor speech from Clive from Electrical Engineering. Please come down.
I feel there's a great injustice here that a member of staff wins a prize at a student debate. So I would like to donate the prize back.
Cool. So I've got the numbers in front of me. Quite a lot of people left during the debate, as usually happens. People have things to do on a Monday night. So we've got less people in each category. What you need to watch is the percentages, how the number of people in the room voting for each side has changed. So before this debate, we had 55 people in proposition. Coming second, we had 38 people in abstention, and coming third, we had 32 people in opposition. So winning was the proposition that austerity had failed in the UK. After the debate, we had 25 people in opposition, we had 30 in abstention, and we had 33 in proposition. So the order stayed the same, but proposition lost 22 votes, opposition lost 7 votes, and abstention lost, I think that says 8 votes. So it looks like the room still thinks austerity has failed, but more people were persuaded that it has not. So that's the result of the debate. That's the result of the winner. Thank you for the vote. And one more round of applause for everyone and everything that has been done. Now we're at the TCR, where we continue the debate in a less open setting. See the people standing at the front and right to the bar at TCR.